This research project addresses how trust in media impacts support for state institutions in Argentina compared to other important independent variables. To facilitate my research, I employ the dataset Latino Barometer and a variety of methods, particularly hierarchical regression and control variables. To analyze the results, I apply the elaboration paradigm. In formulating my research, I consulted the following scholars. McRory recently published an article addressing the importance of media in shaping how people are engaged civically, describing the state-media relationship as a battleground in many Latin American states. Additionally, McRory characterizes Argentina as an ideal case study for examining this relationship. Second, Waits-Shapiro informs my research on how protection of right freedoms influence support for state institutions. Finally, Ariart and Waits can guide my analysis of access to services and programs and how this access translates into support for state institutions. The hypotheses I propose are the following. First, trust in media will positively correlate with support for state institutions. Second, the protection of rights and freedoms will also positively correlate with support for state institutions. This research builds on that of Waits and Shapiro. Third, I build research done by Ariart and Waitskin and hypothesize that greater access to basic services and programs will correlate with stronger support for state institutions. Finally, I suggest that trust in media will be a more accurate predictor of support than the other independent variables. I base this hypothesis on the research performed by Robbie McRory. It is this final hypothesis that guides my overall scope of the research and is the primary puzzle I seek to resolve. In order to operationalize my dependent variable, support for state institutions, I construct an index measuring trust in a variety of state institutions, which produces an alpha score of 0.8163, making it a robust independent variable that will accurately reflect support for state institutions. To operationalize my main independent variable, I construct a second index that reflects levels of trust in the three main media sources. This index also yields an alpha score that is sufficient for use. Additionally, by observing the frequency distribution, we can observe that the trust varies between different media sources, and we can also observe how accurately the indicized variable media, the bold blue line, represents the overall trend. The second independent variable I address is the extent to which respondents feel that their rights and freedoms are being protected. This index produces an alpha score of 0.76, making it appropriate for use as a variable. The third and final independent variable I include are the levels of satisfaction with access to services and programs, which also produces an alpha score sufficient for use at 0.81. The correlation matrix illustrates that trust in media correlates with support for state institutions much more strongly than the other two independent variables. While they are also strong, trust in media is clearly the strongest. Furthermore, all the results are generalizable and are all statistically significant. The preliminary regression confirms that the resulting correlation matrix, specifically that trust in media has the strongest impact with a beta score of 0.394. Again, protection of rights and freedoms both score highly, but not as high as trust in media. These results are also statistically significant, and the tolerance levels are high enough that we can exclude multicollinearity as a possibility. Finally, the adjusted R-square value in the bottom row of the table demonstrates that the set of regression variables accounts for 41.8% of the explained variance, meaning that there is a high degree of internal validity. Now that the preliminary regression is being performed, I apply control variables, the first of which is presidential approval, which is coded as a dichotomous variable. I apply this to check for specificity within the second and third variables. The second control I apply is for media bias. This differs from trust in media in that this is a single dichotomous variable extracted from the dataset that explicitly asks respondents whether they believe the media, broadly speaking, is independent or biased. I apply this variable to investigate whether the original relationship between support for institutions and trust in the media is spurious. The hierarchical regression above provides two models. The first is the preliminary index that was analyzed earlier, and the second model introduces the two control variables, both of which are statistically significant. Additionally, Model 2 increases the adjusted R-square value from 0.418 to 0.446. We see there is variation in the independent variable that measures protection of rights and freedoms, as well as the variable measuring access to services. For both variables, their beta values decline with reduction of the control for presidential approval. Consequently, the above hierarchical regression demonstrates that a more thorough analysis of presidential approval using control variables is required. We can observe that when presidential approval is applied as a control variable, the relationship for both independent variables becomes specific to respondents expressing approval of the president. The relationships between support of state institutions and each of the two independent variables are each weakened when controlling for respondents that disapprove of the president. Therefore, the strong relationships between the independent and dependent variables are specific to respondents who approve of the president. In order to determine whether the original relationship between my index, trust in media, and support for state institutions represents a spurious relationship, I apply a dichotomous control variable that determines whether the respondents believe the media is independent or if it's biased. When applied as a control variable, we observe that the original relationship between the dependent and independent variable, that is the index, does not change substantially and represents a replication of the original relationship, and we can therefore conclude that it is not spurious. To summarize, trust in media represents the strongest of my independent variables, which confirms my original hypothesis, as well as the research done by McCrory. Furthermore, the results are replicated when we apply media bias as a dummy control variable. The variables measuring protection of rights and freedoms, as well as access to services, are also each strong and important indicators, verifying the research of the other scholars. However, when presidential approval is applied as a control, their impact on support becomes strongly specified to respondents who approve of the president. Moreover, these two variables are not as strong as the variable measuring trust in media. These results demonstrate the importance of media in formulating opinions of state institutions. Future research on these topics should include indicators that will allow researchers to control for particular media sources, such as specific newspapers or news channels. Additionally, as Facebook and social media continue to become more relevant to a person's civic engagement, these should both be included in future research.